Hello, welcome back to Modern Languages 331, World Languages and Their Speakers. I'm your professor, Dr. Michael Hughes, and we are learning here at Cal State San Marcos. Today, the topic of the discussion is going to be bilingualism and diglossia, which are related concepts. You can see though one is Latin and one is Greek, right? So bi is two languages, and di is two in Greek for glossia, two tongues. And so we'll see what the difference is in just a minute. But let's start with some definitions of terms. So let's start with language. What's a language? And some languages have, so for instance, Spanish has the difference between lengua and lenguaje, right? Where lengua is the actual code or system that people use, and lenguaje is the ability to speak. English, maybe we don't have quite that uh, flexibility when it comes to this term anyway. But we can think of language, right, as the code of communication. And we've talked about already before how language is a special kind of communication system, is particularly complex, that lets us talk about past, present, and future, lets us talk about imaginary things, lets us have sentences of hypothetically infinite length. Obviously, that's not possible, but recursion and the grammar structures let us keep building more and more sounds, right? And so it's a productive system. Right, and then we can also think of language as being English or Chinese or German or Swahili or whatever. But we also know from our own experience, right, that language is a more complicated thing than that. There's not just one English language. In fact, for any community of any size at all, there's probably more than one variety of the actual language, right? And those different varieties are called dialects. Um, English, for instance, has a bunch of dialects. The United States has fewer dialects than, say, England, where people have been speaking England for a lot longer, and there's lots more sedentaryism historically than here in the United States. But here in the United States, right, you can go from Southern California to Northern California and notice how people speak differently, or head out to Texas and people speak differently. And you go to Louisiana or Florida, New York, New Jersey, something like that, even Montana or Minneapolis, right? These are all people speaking different varieties of language. And those are geographic dialects, but dialects can come from other places too, right? We also have an idiolect, right? The id, if you're a psychologist, you know what that means. And that's just a specific variety of whatever language or languages that you speak. We're not going to talk a lot about that. Grammar in linguistics is more than just don't end your sentence with a preposition. A grammar has a couple of different definitions. One, it's the set of rules that exist in your conventions really is better, right? It's not necessarily logical or rule based, but convention based that you have to be able to talk in your language. It's also the book that we use. We call it a grammar book and a description of the language. Right. A prestige form is the one that everybody looks up to, right? That's the one, for instance, that when you go to college, you need to use a particular prestige form. You need to use an academic variety of English, not necessarily because it's better English per se, but because that's the language that the people in that community use, right? If you're going to be an anchor person on TV, you have to talk a certain way, and that's the prestige form. And if you're, and this is true in almost every society. There's one variety that's spoken typically by some powerful group, whether it's culturally prestigious or wealthy people or religious people, right? That takes the prestige form that other people are going to model and claim that form as the pure or the best form of the language. Okay, let's look a little bit more at dialects. Um, so as I pointed out, right, there are different versions of the language. What that means technically is that a dialect has a different grammar than two different dialects will have two different grammars, right? And they're going to be overlap largely, but they're going to be different in certain ways. And the grammar will include, for instance, how you pronounce things, but it might also be how do you ask questions. It might be how do you use auxiliary verbs and modal verbs like may, might, can, could, right? Can you say he might, ought to do that? Probably not in your dialect of Western English, but in some dialects of American English, you absolutely can. Um, so as we already talked about, it could be geographic origin. It could be socioeconomic class, right? So people in the upper classes, people will speak differently than people in lower classes. And that's a sign, right? So it's useful for us. We know when we hear somebody talk in a movie or when we hear somebody talk on the street, we kind of already have an idea of sort of what part of society they come from. could have something to do with the community history, right? How important is it for your community to preserve the language and the traditions, or how important is it to assimilate into wherever you are? And then you guys can take a look at these maps when you get a chance. I'll put a PDF version of this presentation on the website. They're kind of fun to look at, and you can see how language is different here in the United States for English. Registers closely related to dialect, but it has more to do with an idiolect. So register is how you change your language depending on the social context. And it's not much more complicated than that. You know how that works, right? You wouldn't walk into a job interview or office hours with your professor and be like, yo, bro, what's up? Right? You would say, "Oh, good afternoon, ma'am. How do you do? I'm here for the interview. How do you do, professor? I had a question." Right? When you're hanging out with your friends on the weekend, watching a TV show or the soccer game, is going to be different from how you speak when you're having breakfast on Sunday with your grandma. Right? And that's what register is. And these are systematic ways that language changes. Right? All of this is systematic differences from some hypothetical norm that exists sort of at the core of your language ability. When we talk about language and dialects and register, the context matters a lot, right? The social context matters a lot. And so there's lots of informal uh, language domains, and then there are more formal as we move up, right? We get more formal domains, and we change our language, the language that we use, insofar as it's possible, right? It's a lot easier in first language than in a second or a third language. You change the style of your language to match the social context. And this will be important both for diglossia and also when we talk about code switching. Okay, what's going on here? Oh, sorry, it's just making noises. All right, here we go. So now let's talk a little bit about bilingualism. Many of the people in this class are bilingual. Not everybody in this class is bilingual. No judgment there. You can pass the class as long as you speak at least English, right? Good. So, but let's think about what it means to be bilingual, right? Obviously, again, we talked about diglossia, two tongues in Greek, bilingual, lingua, right? Two tongues in Latin here. So being able to speak two tongues or being able to speak two languages. If you speak more than one language, right, you might be a trilingual. You might also just call yourself a polyglot. Again, that glot, poly, that's one of those weird mixtures between Latin and Greek. Poly meaning many and glot meaning tongue. So if you speak three or more languages, you could either call yourself trilingual or you could call yourself a polyglot. Okay. Um, you know some words from other languages, right? Whether it's other languages in our world, in our social world, and also our system that have some kind of cachet or notoriety, right? So you probably can know some French, je ne sais quoi, and other things like that. You probably know some words in Spanish. Depending on your context, you might know some other words in a language that is in your ancestrally in your family or something like that too, right? And other sorts of things. Some people can speak two languages or more languages, and you can't, either language they sound like a native speaker. That's not super common, um, uh, right? So I guess these two bullets should have been the other way around, but in any case, but there is some kind of a continuum, right? From just sort of basic functional bilingual, being able, use of two languages to being able to speak natively. I've been speaking German since I started learning German when I was like 14 years old. I speak excellent German. I can read Faust. I've read all this stuff. But if you talk to me in German, you'll notice, right, that I still sound like I'm not a native speaker. So if somebody on the other hand, another person who's been speaking German might have been speaking German for only 15 years, so less than me, but they started when they were 5, they're going to sound a lot better, right? So the context and of learning is important as well. Um, I also remember a good friend of mine who I was in Germany, went to college with in Germany. She's an American student, and she was speaking, and she had excellent grammar. She could write in German really, really well. But when you heard her speak, she just sounded like she was reading it with an English, German, just like as though it were English. And so, don't worry, the struggle is real, but not all of us are good at everything. And then, part of being bilingual also has to do with your sociolinguistic and your cultural competence. So it's one thing to know how to use or how to speak a language. It's another thing to know how to be polite, how to be sly, how to be subtle in a different language, how not to offend people. Any of us who've lived in a different country or practiced being bilingual probably has a story or two of saying the wrong thing at the wrong time and not understanding why it was the wrong thing, because it would have been perfectly normal in your home context, right? So knowing a language also has to do something, at least a little bit, with knowing a culture as well. How many people are bilingual? Well, again, it depends on the context where you are and how necessary it is to be bilingual. If you're going to spend your entire life on a farm in Iowa, you don't really need to know French or Chinese, right? If you're going to live in a big city, if you're going to travel a lot, it may be much more advantageous. If you live in a place where there's lots of other cultures coming together, you're doing business with those people, it may be a lot more advantageous to learn a language. We live in the United States, kind of a historically strange place in which you could drive for 5 or 6 days, and if as long as you're driving in the right direction, and never ever ever have to speak a language other than English. That is not historically normal, right? Normally, languages would have been packed much. If you go to Asia, if you go to Europe, if you go to Africa, languages are packed much more densely. And so, if we think about it, there's 192 countries in the world, and 6,000 is probably a generous number, but anywhere, but just let's imagine there's 5,000 languages, right? Which would be pretty conservative estimate. There's still way more languages than there are countries, which means the majority of languages of countries in the world um, recognize at least two languages, and lots of them many more, right? So I work, for instance, in Guatemala. Guatemala's official language is Spanish, but it also has another 23 different language, and that's a country the size of a medium-sized American state. Okay, even here, right in San Diego, if you want to be a teacher, you're probably aware that there's a bunch of different languages that are spoken, and San Diego Unified, the last I checked, this number, will go up and down a little bit here and there, but it's a big, urban school district. There's at least 60 different languages spoken there, right? That's a lot of people speaking a lot of different languages. Um, you can there, and there's other places in the world that are just language hotspots, right? So India, for instance, has 387 different languages, with 15 of them classified as major, right? But by saying that that language is major, you can imagine that it's the largest language in its particular family, but there's a number of different language families as well, and it could also be classified by major depending on the number of people who speak it, which also means, right, that you end up in this sort of situation where when there's 387 languages, nobody's ever going to learn 387 languages. It means everybody, not everybody, but you see a large number of people are going to want to be able to travel from place to place, or listen to the radio, or watch TV, or buy things online, or whatever it is. So they're going to learn a second or a third language so that they can communicate with other people in language. And then that's where you end up with a situation where two or more languages are in consistent use across a broad population. Kenya is another one of those hotspots. 67 different languages are spoken there. And again, you have a couple of languages that rise to the top that are called lingua francas, right? So languages that a lot of people learn, so that lots of people end up talking to each other in a second language in a place like Kenya or India, because not everybody can learn all 67 languages. Um, yeah, so again, right, this is all sort of more of the same sorts of things, but 34 languages, South Africa. In that case, right, it's a highly multicultural country with a particular history. There's 11 official languages, which is unusual. Usually, there's only one or two. Right? And then the world hotspot for languages is Papua New Guinea, with 840 different languages spoken there. Sort of go from one mountain valley to the other, and you find yourself stuck in another language. There's lots and lots of marriage across cultures in that place. So again, a high degree of bilingualism in Papua New Guinea. Okay. Ethnologue it used to be a free site. Now I think now it has a paywall that has tons and tons of data. It's from the what's called the Summer Institute of Linguistics, which is a odd group of people. Well, no, they're not odd. They're perfectly nice. But as an institution, it's not a normal academic institution. It's a religious-based institution that has as its goal to translate the New Testament into all of the languages of the world. And as part of that mission, they train tons and tons of people who to go and translate languages, and therefore they have lots and lots of data that they share with other academics, and institutionally, the institution can pay for it. It's not that expensive, but like I said, used to be free. So the world is changing fast. But anyway, again, remembering that bilingualism has a broad definition. When we say 50% of the world is bilingual, that doesn't mean that 50% of the world can read great works of literature in a second language. It means that they can get around and do the things that they need to do in the second language, sell, buy, get a place to sleep, get some food to eat, things like that. I mean, who knows, fall in love, sing songs, party with other World Cup teams, that kind of thing. And why would you want to be bilingual? I mean, for those of us who already speak two languages, sometimes it wasn't a choice, sometimes it was. You can talk to more people. That's kind of nice, right? So if you speak English, you can talk to a good billion people in the world, and if you speak Spanish too, that adds another 500 million people. Um, and depending on which languages you decide to choose, you can talk to more and more people. And then, of course, it also is useful for in all sorts of socio-economic ways, right? In terms of being able to sell things to more people, buy things from more people, do business, and have international relationships and things like that. Individually, it's said to improve executive function. How noticeable is that? I don't really know. But people who speak more than one language have to switch back and forth between languages, and that requires a different sort of brain functions. And so, in principle, it improves executive function at least a little bit. It's said to delay the onset of Alzheimer's disease, which is important to me. My mother has Alzheimer's disease. She never learned a second language. I speak, a couple, so hopefully we'll see. Uh, I'd say I'd let you know, but if it happens, I'll forget to tell you. Um, some people think there's improved problem-solving abilities. One of the things that happens, right, for instance, and also a lot of people will talk about sort of a higher tolerance for ambiguity, or being able to exist in a more ambiguous state, because you have different names for lots of different things, right? And so when you look at a cup, if you're bilingual, you have at least two names, three names, four names for that different thing, and switching back and forth, and being able to identify those sorts of things in a chaotic field is something that bilingualism helps you do. Okay, so that's what bilingualism is about. Several of you are probably bilingual. If you're not, no shame, but you got time. Go for it. Go learn another language. Talk to more people. Okay, now let's talk about diglossia. Again, same basic etymology as bilingualism, but here it's a Greek root, and it's a slightly and when we talk about bilingualism, we're talking about two different languages. When we talk about diglossia, we're going to talk about. Remember, we talked about register, and we talked about dialect. We're basically talking in a diglossic situation of two dialects of the same language, or at least one dialect that's going to be the sort of the one that is common to more people, and then people in that language will also have their own local dialects or socioeconomic dialects. Right. So more technically, the simultaneous use of two or more language varieties in distinct social domains. Right. So we talked about social domains, right? Family, church, work, media, social media, all the different things within the same speech community. Right. So and there's lots of languages in the world that have really broad geographic um, uh, uh, presence, and so you get lots of dialects in there, and it can be advantageous to pick one of those dialects out as the best, or right, not the best in any kind of scientific sense, but the one that everybody's going to learn, the one that's going to be used for education. Right. This is really common in Arabic and German. Have basically the same situation, right? And so I'm familiar with German. I'll talk about that. If you know about Arabic, hopefully this doesn't sound incorrect to you. But right, I mean, if you think about Arabic, right? Arabic stretches from Morocco in Northwest Africa all the way across all of North Africa into Saudi Arabia, right? Iraq, and that's a large group of people that historically haven't had a lot of interaction, right? So today you can hop on a plane and fly from Cairo to Morocco. 500 years ago, you're a peasant in Morocco. There's no way that you're going to get to Cairo in any kind of without a lot of strange things happening first, right? So different dialects are going to develop across the Arabic speech area, and in order to maintain kind of some sort of communication, usually, across elites at the very least, you'll pick one language, which is called classical Arabic. It's not classical Arabic in the sense that it's a 500-year-old version of Arabic. It's just called that. It's a modern dialect of Arabic, right? The same is true in German. So if you're in North Germany, right on the Baltic Sea coast, and you travel down to Munich right at the foothills of the Alps, and you go out to the countryside in either place, let's take a country person from northern Germany and stick him in a bar with a country person from southern German. They'll have a couple beers and figure it out eventually, but they don't speak the same dialect. And if you go to Austria or Switzerland, the case gets even um, more intense, where if you wanted to, you could call Swiss German a different language from the German that's spoken in northern Germany and say Hamburg or Berlin, right? But they don't want to do that, right? Because they want to be thought of as sort of a cultural group and a cultural unity. So, but there is this variety of German that was spoken by Martin Luther. Well, it's sort of spoken by him, quasi. That's called High German. It's called High German. There's another variety of German that's Low German. It's actually a different, completely different language in the same family. But Low German is called Low German because it's spoken in the flatlands, and High German is called High German because it's spoken in the foothills and the mountains in southern Germany. Right. That's why it's high and low, not necessarily a judgment there. But again, if you do go to school in Munich or in Graz or in Bern or Zurich, the language you speak at home will be different from the language that's on TV and will be different from the language that you learn at school, right? You'll go to school. Part of the reason you go to school as a Swiss person is going to be to learn this High German so that you can talk across borders and across counties and things like that. Right. The languages don't have to be related, though, right? So if you were to go to Uruguay, you would find out that Uruguay is a very interesting case. It is one of the few places where there's widespread bilingualism with a European and an indigenous American language. And there's actually kind of three varieties, right? There's a pure Spanish language, there's a pure Guarani language, and then there's this sort of middle ground that's kind of a mixture of both that most people speak when they're trying to communicate with people. And it'll be the similar situation. There will be a lot of social places where the normal sort of Guarani is spoken, but when you go to the bank in the capital, when you go to certain other sort of highfalutin places, Spanish will be more common. Right? Again, right, if you're in Germany and you're trying to do a business deal, you're going to use High German regardless of what your base dialect is, right? Otherwise, it would just sound funny. That's just not done. Okay. Typically, the high variety, right? We'll call it H. That's the one, right? That's um, the one that stretches across borders and across dialect zones. Is thought to be more logical, thought to be more elegant, and thought to be superior. And excuse my French here. I'm going to be diglossic right now. That's bullshit, right? It's not more logical, more elegant, or superior, but the people who speak it think they are, and they want to present that as true. Right? The high variety, for instance, in Arabic or in German, is the variety that's going to be used more often in a business setting. It's going to be used more often in a university setting, right? So the people who use this language and are so proud of using it because it's so elegant and logical are the people who are powerful in that society, either in terms of wealth or in terms of cultural capital or academics and things like that, right? There's nothing you can say in the high variety that you can't also say in the low variety. There's nothing you could, right? Okay, maybe there's some weird physics, but you could come up with a way to say anything in any dialect. And that's true for languages in general, right? So there's lots of idioms and there's lots of things that, turns of phrases that are unique to a language, but there's nothing in German that can't be translated into English. Maybe, it'll have more or fewer words. It won't be an idiom, but it'll still mean the same thing. Okay, and that's true with high and low varieties, and that's true for you, right? When you hear somebody from Louisiana, they're talking kind of funny like this, and you're like, "Well, that person's probably pretty stupid." They're not necessarily stupid. They're no more stupid than somebody from LA, right? They just have a dialect that is stigmatized. It's one of the L varieties in a diglossic situation, right? And so just keep that in mind. Okay. Um, Right. So, and you can see, right, if you think about what we talked about as in the different language contexts, these are the ones that are the more formal contexts, and then the more informal context is where we're going to get the um, the lower variety, right, the L variety. And again, we say lower and higher here, knowing as linguists and people studying language that those are value judgments that are put on by other people, and we're going to try to stay away from that and analyze the languages as we find them, right? Okay. Right, and you can see how this goes, right? The use of the lower version in the wrong situation can mark you out. Can people can ridicule you. They say, "Oh, look there, look the bumpkin," or something like that, right? So you need to be careful about that. And you guys know how that works, right? You guys are now in a kind of a similar situation where the language you use at home and the language you're forced to use in the workplace or the classroom might be slightly different. And using the wrong term can get you in trouble, just like I swore a little bit, right? And that's out of the ordinary for that for particular variety. Okay. Um, so what are the takeaways here? This, oh, by the way, is a version of a relatively early version of the Luther Bible, and that's why Luther was so important in the German context, because there were so many people who spoke different dialects of German. He was trying to translate the Bible into a variety of German that the most amount of people in that Sprachraum or language area or linguistic community could read. And so it's kind of an artificial dialect. Nobody actually speaks it as a native dialect, but you all learn it. Germans all learn it as they go. Okay, this comes with a whole other set of social changes that are also really interesting, but this is not the place for that. So what are the takeaway things for this particular concept? Two or more varieties in the same speech community. So other people in the world can be fluent in not only in more than one language, but more than one version of the same language, right? You can be bidialectal in English, or in these cases, you can speak the low and the high variety, just as long as you know what the context is. The context is key, right? The variety that you choose to speak has something to, but you could also see it in movies too, right? Where people want to be sort of brash or right, they'll choose the low dialect in a high dialect situation just to establish a conflict, for instance. It can be really useful. We're good at this sort of thing as humans. It's a social distinction, not a linguistic distinction. Prestige, the idea that some varieties of a language are better, that more logical, they're more pristine, they're more beautiful, they're more reflective of our beautiful, inner spirit. That's bullshit. It's just not true. You can hear street poets and you can hear poets from the academy. Some of them are better. It's just not a thing, right? If you can say it in one language, you can say it in the other language. And it will change, right? So the diglossic relationship can change as the social conditions change as well. Okay, so if you have any questions, you know how to get in touch with me, mhughes@csusm.edu, or you can message me on the Canvas app. Hopefully this was interesting to you, and you should be thinking about how you use your language as you go through the day. Okay, auf Wiedersehen.